All right, so we know a little bit about how it is that the Cherokee Nation found itself crossways of the federal government and brought suit in Cherokee Nation v. Georgia. Lindsay Robertson is back with us to tell us a little bit about the significance and some of the ramifications of this court case. So tell us a little bit about what happens with Cherokee Nation v. Georgia. How does that come up to the court?
Well, Johnson versus McIntosh had created or incorporated into American law this discovery rule that said, among other things, that the discovering European sovereign, or by implication its successor in interest, owned the title to Indian lands. Georgia, in 1802, had ceded whatever claims it had to its charter lands, including what became the states of Mississippi and Alabama, to the United States in exchange, in part, for a promise from the United States that it would get rid of the Indians, that it would send negotiators down to sign treaties with the Creeks and the Cherokees who were in northwestern Georgia.
This is the 1802 compact.
This is in 1802, right.
Yeah.
Time passed, nothing happened, primarily because, well, the Muskogee Creeks eventually signed a treaty and moved west. But the Cherokees weren't interested in leaving, and the U.S. would send negotiators down. The Cherokees would say, we're quite comfortable, thanks, and they'd say, okay, and they'd go home. And Georgia eventually decided, well, we've got to do something ourselves, and they didn't have too many options. They couldn't declare war. The Constitution says only the U.S. can do that. They couldn't enter into a treaty. The Constitution says only the United States can do that. And then Johnson versus McIntosh was decided, and it said that the discovering European sovereign or its successor in interest, by implication, owned title to Indian land. So Georgia figured, okay, so we own the lands that the Cherokee Nation lives on. And what that means is that, to put it into terms that they used at the time and that we still understand now, we're their landlord. We own the building and they're the tenant. Now, how do you get rid of a tenant you don't like if they've got sort of, a long-term lease? Well, you modify the lease terms. Like now you'd say, well, pets, I love your dogs, but you can't have pets anymore. So you can stay, but you got to get rid of your pets. And what Georgia did was to pass a statute in December 1828 that said, you all can stay as long as you want, Cherokees, but from now on, you're parts of 5 Georgia counties. Georgia law will apply there.
Yours will not.
And yours will not, and ours will apply to you effective June 1830. So the clock's ticking. You got less than 18 months to figure out what you want to do. Now you can stay and lose your institutions and your law and be subject to ours, or if you want, you could go somewhere else. And Andrew Jackson, who had just been elected president, said, I can help with this, as they knew he would. He pushed through something called the Indian Removal Act of 1830.
Right.
It doesn't say, many people think it says the tribes have to remove. It doesn't say that. It says you all are about to be subjected to state law. That's a valid exercise of state power. You can stay if you want to, but if you want to move, we will trade you your lands in Georgia or wherever it happens to be for lands out in basically what was the southwestern corner of the United States, because it's the border with Mexico at the time.
Let me ask you this. When Georgia kind of rewrites its lease agreement, how does it understand how Indians will be treated under its rules?
Well, as Georgians, which is to say there are a few provisions that I think were in there just largely to be obnoxious. Provision, you have to have if you're non-Indian, you have to have a license from the state of Georgia, and you have to swear an oath of allegiance to the governor and this sort of thing. But the real goal was simply to subject these folks to essentially regular Georgia jurisdiction, meaning if you committed a crime, then Georgia's going to arrest you, haul you back into a Georgia court for prosecution, and send you to a Georgia prison.
Okay, so what does the Cherokee Nation, which is by now calling itself the Cherokee Nation after the ratification of the Constitution in 28, how does it respond?
Well, Cherokee Nation decides we're going to use the U.S. system. We're going to go to court. And we're gonna see if we can get the Supreme Court to tell the state of Georgia to cut it out. They had some sense that the court would be receptive to the claim. I think in the end it turned out to be a well-founded sense that the court would be receptive to the claim. You know, John Marshall himself had kind of created the problem, and I think that's part of the reason that the court was willing to flip as far as it did. There's a small case that should have been a bigger case, the case of a Cherokee named Tassel. This is the worst instance of the application of Georgia laws. This guy was accused of murdering another Cherokee Nation citizen. He was a citizen of Cherokee Nation, should have been prosecuted by the Cherokees, but Georgia went in and got him. Hauled him out and sentenced him to death. He protested, tried to get relief from the Supreme Court of the U.S., which sent a note down to the governor of Georgia saying, you know, we want to talk about this. Don't harm this man. And the governor of Georgia said, you have no jurisdiction over me. Sent an order out, and they executed this guy on Christmas Eve. I think that was upsetting to Marshall. And I, you know, so the whole sort of sequence of events was upsetting. So what does the court do? Well, the case got filed as what we call an original jurisdiction case in the Supreme Court. Supreme Court can take original jurisdiction, meaning they sit as a trial court with witnesses and stuff, over a fairly small class of cases, but they include...
Usually they have to run up the chain.
Usually they only come up on appeal. You start in the trial court and you don't like what the trial judge says, you appeal, and then you appeal again. But these cases, you go straight to the Supreme Court of the United States, and one of the classes of original jurisdiction cases are suits between foreign states, foreign countries, and states of the United States. So if France sues Oklahoma, the Supreme Court hears it.
And this is the way that the Cherokee Nation tries to bring it.
So the Cherokee Nation files suit as the Cherokee Nation, a foreign state, against Georgia. Cherokee Nation v. Georgia, 1831. Georgia declines to participate.
Just doesn't show up.
Yeah, Supreme Court hears argument, and it's a hard time actually accepting the case. And in the end, they decide that they don't have jurisdiction. We have a bunch of different opinions. There is no clear majority, but the opinion that we think of as the Cherokee Nation opinion is the one written by John Marshall. And Marshall says, you know, they're a state, like a nation, but they're not a foreign state. Tribes are different. They're what we might more properly denominate, he says, a domestic dependent state or a domestic dependent nation. That's one of the important linguistic legacies, right, of Cherokee Nation. We hear that a lot.
And maybe one of the most confusing.
And maybe one of the most confusing. And then he says, to further explicate what he means by that, he says their relationship with the United States, the relationship of tribes with the United States, resembles that of a, this is a quote, ward to his guardian.
Right.
So this is the source of, that language, one paragraph in Cherokee Nation is the source of two sort of lines of discussion. What's a domestic dependent nation? And what does it mean that tribes are wards and the federal government is a guardian? Now, I'll tell you, at the time, these didn't have any legal meaning. They're simply explanations for why Marshall, in his opinion, can't find that the Supreme Court has original jurisdiction under Article 3 of the Constitution.
And so that's the final ruling.
Precise.
Sorry, that's the final ruling that the court says is they're not going to hear the case. Right.
And the opinion concludes, you know, we're sympathetic to the issues raised here, and in a proper case with proper parties, we'd be glad to resolve them.
They're asking for another case.
They're asking the Cherokees for another case, so the Cherokees treat this as a win. Georgia, because the case gets dismissed, treats it as a win also. And that's Cherokee Nation versus Georgia.
Great.